everybody. We're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Kristen.
And I'm Dr. Erin.
And you are very welcome to our corner of the internet for this installment of the Colonizers World Tour, in which we are chatting about Italian colonies. And let me tell you, real quick, before we started this research, I had no concept of the Italians as colonizers. And oh buddy, did Mussolini have some thoughts, feelings, and actions against the peoples of several countries, Ethiopia included.
But they're not, good at it. That's the thing that kills me.
They're terrible at it. And, even in Ethiopia, where they weren't full colonizers, they were just occupiers, they were still terrible at it.
They tried, 2 or 3 times in Ethiopia, and, the only time it stuck was, when Mussolini occupied them during the Second World War. We'll get into it, but it's just hilarious. I just kept chuckling. I'm like, man, there's a couple great videos in the downstairs in our Google Doc, and I was just where they're explaining it, and I was like, man, you're bad at this.
I just could imagine, Britain, patting them on the head, oh, you cute little colonizers,
It's like they came in, I forget what it's called, there's, a phrase for, when all the European nations started,
the scramble for Africa.
Yeah, the Great Scramble. Yeah, the great, scramble for Africa. And it's Italy, got the memo a little bit, forgot to check their email. And then they checked their email and they were like, oh shit, we're scrambling for Africa?
Yeah,
let's go!
We forgot. Spoiler alert, because I've worked ahead just a little bit in our schedule. They were, a lot of their terribleness was concentrated on Libya. So tune in next week when we talk about Libya.
Was closer. It was a lot easier to get to for the Italians. And, naturally seafaring folks. So, they could just hop in a boat and get to Libya. It's a little more complicated getting to Ethiopia and Somalia.
Yeah, well, speaking of Ethiopia, what did you know about the country before we started researching it, Dr. Dear Erin?
Similar to a lot of places in Africa, which was not my study, my area of focus in my studies, I knew it was in Africa, and other than that, was pretty much flying blind. I think I did go to an Ethiopian restaurant in Pittsburgh once. It is now in its 4th incarnation of still an Ethiopian restaurant, but it's not the same one I went to, because the one I went to, we sat on cushions and the table was really low. But I remember really enjoying it. And that was my friend was let's go to an Ethiopian restaurant. I was okay. But I don't remember anything so much except we used the injera to eat everything. And it was all eating with our hands, but I vaguely remember having a good time. I don't know if I enjoyed the food or not, because it was literally 15 years ago. So, that didn't really help me out in my understanding of Ethiopia, except I knew what injera was and what it tasted like. How about yourself?
So I'm a little bit up on you because I've been to Ethiopia for a couple
days. Just a little bit up.
Still learned an absolute ton. So we went to visit, my dad and I went to visit some friends of ours who were working as missionary surgeons in Addis Ababa, because I could never remember how to say how many Ababas there were. I have called it so many things over the years. But there's not a lot of really high level surgical care in Ethiopia. At all. So he was doing a lot of orthopedic reconstructive surgery. So one of my memories of Ethiopia is going into his surgery and then promptly leaving because I don't do blood very well. But I like the idea of injera a lot more than I like eating it because it's sour. It's all fermented. It's made from for a grain that is naturally gluten-free that they ferment in order to make it. Most of Ethiopian food is sour in some way. It's very vegetable based. So if you're not a particularly fermented fan, if you don't love kombucha and you don't love, you might not love Ethiopian. But it's always served on this giant plate of injera. You don't use any utensils. Dr. Erin's completely right. There's some videos in the downstairs that explain it all. We were on Ethiopian Airlines and they came through and they said, do you want an Ethiopian meal or a Western meal? And my dad and I decided to get one of each because why not?
When in Rome.
So I took 2 bites. We each took about a bite of the injera and then shared the Western meal because that sour flavor is just not for us. And that's totally fine. But it is a naturally gluten-free bread. So one of the things just as an aside, that several of the Ethiopian restaurants I read about on Google and things talk about that they like exploded to popularity in the States in the mid-aughts because word got out that they were gluten-free.
Yeah, that's so funny.
But it's really expensive gluten-free bread. So now, if you now hat tip to anybody gluten-free who is celiac, if you go to an Ethiopian restaurant, do not assume the injera is gluten-free because they have to cut it with regular flour in order to afford to make it. So make sure to request. They will absolutely serve a traditional fermented injera bread, but make sure to request the gluten-free if you need it, because now these days they're having to add other flours to it. Lots and lots of fun things in Ethiopia. It's a weird, wonderful, wacky place.
Oh,
so
boy.
Let's head to the map. Ethiopia is in Eastern Africa. It touches Somalia. This is another reason the Italians were like, okay, well, I guess both. Sure, we'll take them. What's really interesting, as we'll get into it, is it's a kingdom that traces itself back to the biblical Solomon. So why the Ethiopians thought like they were ripe for takeover? Just so many questions. It's got three main crops that are like understood to have originated in Ethiopia. So if you don't know where it is on the map, you have tasted it in your belly. So coffee comes from Ethiopia. Grain sorghum, which is a sugar used to make especially molasses, comes from Ethiopia, and the castor bean. Those things are in like all of our diets all the time, and they all originated in Ethiopia. There's around 113 million people at the last census. They're mostly in the north and the middle, and those are considered the highlands. They're a lot lusher than the south, which is very desert-y and a little bit different. In terms of cities, Addis Ababa is the capital, but there are other big ones. Addis Ababa and Dire Dawa are kind of the two biggest. You have probably heard, if you follow Africa at all, you have heard of Addis because it is the seat of the African Union. So just like Brussels is the seat of the European Union, Addis is the seat of the African Union. Languages, the two officials are Amoro and Amharic. Both of which are Coptic languages, which means they use Coptic alphabets and don't even try. But there are so many others because just like every other country in Africa, it wasn't a country necessarily until borders were kind of imposed upon them. Even though this kingdom traces itself back, the modern borders were still imposed by Western powers. And so there's a lot of that. My friend Corinne, who was the wife of the surgeon living in Ethiopia at the time, had just come from Kenya and had learned Swahili. I found a lot easier time learning Swahili. She told me she was doing Amharic classes because like English literacy is very, very low. And there were several people that told her just to learn Italian and like not even bother with Amharic. So English is taught in schools, but schools don't always exist outside of Dire Dawa and Addis. They just don't. Ethnic and indigenous, there are four main ethnic families, as it were, but then of course lots and lots of iterations of those, smaller groups. People have varying identities and understandings of themselves within this. Amoro and Amhara are the two biggest. The Amoro people, by the way, are very much trying to make themselves an internet presence at the moment. And there's lots of Amhoro diaspora, especially in America and Australia, and trying very hard to raise awareness of some ethnic cleansing that has happened against them, some language cleansing that has happened. So if you are interested in languages, I would Google Amoro people, Omoro, and see how you can get involved in that, because it's a pretty good gateway right now. Currency-wise, they use these birr, B-I-R-R. It's about 51 birr to $1 right now. And that's around, I remember paying 55 birr to $1 10 years ago. So it's been pretty stable. System of government, it's a federal parliamentary republic with 10 ethnic-based regions. They have 50 national level and regional level political parties, and I thought Northern Ireland exhausted me. So, like, that's a lot. That's just a lot. And like we said, like I keep saying, this thing has been a monarchy and was a monarchy for a really long time. Like, into the 20th century a monarchy. And so that's going to be something that's very important. Even in their federal parliamentary republic, like the monarchy still kind of looms large, as it were. And one of the most beloved leaders, and definitely the most famous, is Selassie, who was the king for most of the middle of the 20th century. And we'll talk about him a little bit more in my Jeopardy Fun Fact, because Selassie is one of my favorites. So before we have not talked about religion so far in a lot of because it's like, oh, it's Arabic, and we kind of understand Arabic. What I have learned in the last 10 years of telling people I went to Ethiopia is that no one really knows what the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is. So what I would love to unpack for you right now is that about 45% of people in Ethiopia are still practicing Ethiopian Orthodox. The rest are made up of various Protestant denominations brought in by missionaries and Islam. It is a culturally religious place, and many people consider it culturally Christian and religiously Christian, a Christian nation in that way. So Eleanor is going to pop up a really quick visual to help you understand all of the different splits of the Christian church. So the first thing to know, the very first schism between any kind of Christians happened a lot long before the Reformation, I promise. So it was actually in 451, and two groups split off. You get the Catholic Church splits off. What becomes the Catholic Church splits off from what becomes the Oriental Orthodox Church, which is what the Ethiopians belong to. Then in 1051, there's another schism, and that's when we get like the Greek and Russian Orthodox, the European Orthodox movements. And then in the 1500s, Martin Luther forgot to take his Xanax, pitched a big old temper tantrum, and we get all the Protestant churches. But there's been a lot of movements, and it is always over what is the Bible and who is Jesus. Every time somebody splits, it's over what is the Bible and who is Jesus. So the Oriental Orthodox deeply believe that they are the closest, because they split in 451 and they haven't changed since. God love them. They believe 100% they are the closest to the apostles, to the people that walked and bred and dealt with Jesus. There's a whole lot of theological stuff that if you're curious, there's some videos. I'm also happy to talk to you about it. I find it fascinating. I won't bore everybody who doesn't care. But if you're ever wondering why there are different groups of Christians, that's really what it comes down to. Who is Jesus to you, and what is the Bible to you? And there's a lot of things like that. So Ethiopian Orthodox is very visually distinctive. Their priests wear long black robes with very specific hats. Their churches there's a great Rick Steves video in the downstairs actually that takes you inside an Ethiopian Orthodox church. Visualization icons are very important in all Orthodoxy, so it's going to look very different than any church you've seen if you've never been in an Orthodox church. Ethiopian Orthodox has a lot less gold than Greek Orthodox if you've been in one of those, but it's still a lot about icons, or Russian Orthodox if you've been in a lot of those. So faith is very, very important. And it is not necessarily a point of massive contention, but there are definitely, it isn't like wars have been fought. Like, blood has not been shed in Ethiopia recently over who believes what. But the tensions are definitely there, and there's groupings of people for sure. And there's lots of conversation over what faith has the right to tell the other faiths how they treat the poor and how they treat women's bodies. Those are two of the biggest points of contention. Because, and I'm sure Erin will get into it when she gets into human rights, Ethiopia is the place of the largest percentage of female genital mutilation in the world. So many tribes practice it. It's really culturally accepted outside of Addis, where it's technically illegal. But how the hell do you enforce it? And there's a lot of theology wrapped up in it for a lot of the tribes that have taken Ethiopian Orthodoxy and made it their own. So just a little bit of a preview to do that. In terms of economy, it's the second most populous country in Africa, but it has the lowest level of it has a low level of income inequality, which is really, really great. But it's still super poor. And so income inequality, really low income inequality, is beautiful, except nobody has money. Nobody can eat. And so that's a really important thing to keep in mind. They have rapid population growth because birth control is not ever available, whether it's approved or not. The availability is hard. I mean, when I was in Ethiopia, I heard stories of people walking 2-3 days to the doctor and that was in 2009. There's not infrastructure. There's just not. And then there was a massive drought, massive famine. I would venture to guess they're still not out of either one of those things. And then, as we all know, then the COVID showed up. So things probably aren't pretty great. The state is heavily involved in the economy, as you can imagine, coming from a monarchy that technically believed it owned everything. So it's very easy to blame the government for the lack of everything. And there's probably some truth to that, especially in that they haven't really ever engaged in trade. And very much to their monarchy kind of had the Japanese approach of isolationism, except they couldn't feed their own people, where Japan could for a couple hundred years. So it's an interesting little place in terms of that. And now I will turn it over to my esteemed colleague for everything else about Ethiopia.
Literally everything else.
Go.
The rest of Ethiopia falls to me. In terms of demographics, similarly to what Dr. Kristen said with the economy, it's a predominantly agricultural country. More than 80% of the population lives in rural areas. But it is in this early stages of demographic transition towards the cities. Infant, child, and maternal mortality rates have fallen sharply over the past decade, but the total fertility rate has declined more slowly, so that means the population is still growing really rapidly. We've seen a slight reduction in fertility because the rising age of marriage and the increasing number of women who are like, nah, marriage is not for me, and remaining single. So some of these, different interpretations of gender and gender roles in society are working their way into Ethiopian culture in a few ways. It was so funny. I'm sorry, I was just reading the contraceptive rate. So it's gone up from 6% in 2000 to 27% in 2012.
And we need to celebrate that, but
27% is still really low. I want to think, I'm trying to remember what it was for Somalia. Somalia has a relatively low contraceptive rate, and I think it was in the 50s. So going from 6% to 27%, is good, but still quite low.
Yeah.
So the rapid population growth is, as it usually does, having an impact on land resources, environmental changes, climate change, and food shortages. More than 40% of the population is below the age of 15. And they have a fertility rate of over 5 children per woman. And that rate is even higher so that's the average. In Ethiopia, that rate is even higher in rural areas where then they also don't have access to infrastructure, medication, doctors, etc., etc. They have a very low literacy rate, 51%, and school life expectancy is 9. So that goes into a lot of the socio-educational, the socio-religious aspects of Ethiopian culture as well. As Dr. Kristen said, poverty, drought, political repression, and forced government resettlement have been a huge factor in Ethiopia's internal and external migration since the 1960s. Before the 1974 revolution, only a small number of the Ethiopian elite went abroad to study and then returned home. But under that brutal Derg regime, thousands fled the country, primarily as refugees. So we've seen a huge spread in that. Between 82 and 91, there was a new wave of migration to the West for family reunification. So people who had fled in the 70s. Since the defeat of Derg in 1991, Ethiopians have migrated to escape violence among the, varying ethnic groups, or to pursue economic opportunities. Internal and international trafficking of women and children for domestic work and prostitution is on the up, which is not a great indicator either for demographics or the economy. Human rights. I am not going to talk about female genital mutilation, even though it is very high, because the majority of what I fell down in terms of a rabbit hole was the current human rights situation in the Tigray region, which is in Ethiopia. So one of the interesting
Note my
things,
shock that you found an indigenous population
well, it's
that
like,
needs our attention. Just note my shock.
so one of the things that Dr. Kristen did mention about the government that I think is so interesting is they wrote into their constitution that any of the regions, the 10 regions, which are divided largely along ethnic lines, except the Amoro region is really weird geographically. Like, just look at a map. The Amoro region is like, what's the, like a boomerang. It's like a boomerang shape. It's so weird. Don't get me into, gerrymandering district lines or whatever. But so every region has the opportunity to secede from the Ethiopian government. It was written into their constitution, y'all. This country is so fascinating. So there's a conflict ongoing between the Ethiopian government and the Tigray region, or Tigray region, depending on who pronounces it. In terms of varying groups in Ethiopia, they all pretty much have People's Liberation Front attached to the end of it, and their geographic location or ethnic denomination attached to the front of it. So the big the region's ruling party in Tigray is the Tigray People's Liberation Front, and the TPLF was in government control for a long time, even though ethnically they're like 5% of the population. So this was a bit of a problem. And then it's like, there's so many machinations of like groups coming together, different leaders, et cetera, et cetera. But we had a new group form about 10 years ago that the TPLF did not join. And it became this like kind of large scale coalition of parties, ethnic and regional parties. And the TPLF didn't join it. And then the big party got elected into government. And so since then, the TPLF has been like, we're not in power anymore. We want to do our own thing. So they've been pushing back against the Ethiopian government. And in November 2020, the Ethiopian government was like, no, and began military operations in the Tigray region. And that has been the largest source of human rights issues going on. And I found a lot of articles, and there's a couple in the downstairs in the Google Doc, talking about the scale of this humanitarian crisis and the fact that we aren't talking about it. Especially because it is still ongoing to this day. There was just a ceasefire in March, I think, where they're going to try but I had not heard of it at all. And as we have often had this discussion on this channel and in our little corner of the internet, that the dominance of stories coming out of Ukraine, when this is a very similar situation in terms of a sovereign nation. They're not invading another sovereign nation, but that's by the by. Yeah, so it's the fighting and continued restrictions on humanitarian access have forced more than 2 million people to flee their homes, most of them fleeing to Sudan, neighboring Sudan. 2.3 million are in need of assistance. There's widespread pillaging of crops, livestock, looting, and occupation of Tigrayan homes, destroyed resources of livelihood. Tigrayans have faced mass arrest and prolonged arbitrary detention in formal and informal detention sites where detainees were killed, tortured, and ill-treated. Like, the list goes down. Regional authorities have imposed discriminatory rules that deny Tigrayans basic services and access to humanitarian aid. They have endured ethnic-based slurs that target their identity. They're banned from speaking their own language. People with disabilities and older people obviously have been especially affected. Women and girls have been doubly victimized by warring parties that subject them to, as we know, horrific acts of sexual violence. And then they deliberately obstruct their access to care for the ramifications of those. So the Tigrayan rebels have agreed to a cessation of hostilities in March of this year, following the Ethiopian government's announcement of an indefinite humanitarian truce. In total, as many as 500,000 people have died from war and famine in the Tigray region in the past 16 months. 500,000 humans in the past 16 months. 50 to 100,000 of those are victims of direct killings, 150,000 to 200,000 because of starvation, and more than 100,000 additional deaths caused by lack of health care. More than 400,000 people have been displaced, and nearly 40% of Tigray's population faces an extreme lack of food. So, aside from all the other humanitarian issues that Ethiopia has, this is the one that when I was looking up stuff on our normal sources, Human Rights Watch, all that jazz, everyone was talking about Tigray, and I'd never heard of it. So now I've heard of it, and now you have heard of it too. And we are moving on to the history of colonization, which is just the part where I get to tell you just how bad Italy was at colonizing. Ethiopia is
they're not going to get a gold star. And I have a feeling, we haven't gotten there yet, but I have a feeling where they're not going to get a gold star in managing their own country either. Like, just...
And, like, Italy's a fascinating country, and obviously, as in my background in Italian Renaissance art, I know a lot more about it, but, like, it's not been a country for very long either.
No.
And it was a lot of warring ducal states for a long time that still contribute to a lot of political, like, infighting and, like, regional differences and all of this. So, like, Italy has a hard time with Italy.
So, like, why are we, like, manage your own house first, my dudes?
I know. So it's just like, you can call it tribal if you want, or like ethnic or geographic regional differences in Italy. Certainly there's a lot of cultural differences, like between Sicily and Tuscany and Venice and all these other regions. But like, why would you then go try and colonize a place that looks like you? In terms of, like, ethnic differences.
I mean, I will say, though, Mussolini is not known for his logic.
No, that's true. That's true. But their first attempt at colonization goes back a little before Mussolini, but we'll get to that. So, Ethiopia is the oldest independent country in Africa and one of the oldest in the world. At least 2,000 years old. It may be traced back to the Aksumite kingdom, which coalesced in the 1st century BCE, before the Common Era. We're gonna go to the 1st century BCE. It's just Ethiopia is a place where a lot of ethnic and indigenous groups live until 1894, 1896. So we've jumped, big time jump. That was the first Italo-Ethiopian war, where Italians already had Italian Eritrea and Italian Somaliland, and Ethiopia is the land in between. The Brits had the other part over here, so they like couldn't go that way, and they were like, oh, it would be so much easier to get from Eritrea to Somaliland if we could go through Ethiopia.
And they're like, sorry lads.
Yeah, the Ethiopians had other plans. So Italy signed a treaty with Menelik II, who was the monarch at the time. But there were 2 treaties, one in Italian and one in, whatever language Menelik spoke. And
I think it was on Amharic.
Amharic, I think it was Amharic, yeah. So the one in Italian had a kind of a loophole in it, which not smart. Again, Italians. So Menelik assembled an army of 200,000 humans, and they bought a bunch of guns from Russia, and he is the best. He lied about the state of Ethiopia, like, to the Italians. He was just like, no, we're just a bunch of, like, rural farm people. We don't have, like, any organization tactics or whatever. And portrayed it as much more underdeveloped and under-resourced than it was in reality, which I think is genius. But the ancient Ethiopian monarchy, as Dr. Kristen said, maintained its freedom from colonial rule, except for the Italian occupation of 1936 to 1941. So thus a part of the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. The Italians didn't get a lot from the annexation and committed loads of atrocities over a population that they never really managed to fully control. The combined land mass, so Italian Eritrea, Italian Somalia, Italian Ethiopia, was considered Italian East Africa from 1936 to 1941. But the aforementioned Haile Selassie returned in 1930 and started to form the resistance. And then the Brits ended up helping the Italians out in 1941. So they managed to get on the side of the Allies in the Second World War, and that helped them out a lot. Haile Selassie implemented a lot of democratic measures, but overall the country was slow to modernize. And in 1974, there was a military junta where the Derg deposed Haile Selassie and established a socialist state. You know what this means, folks. You've been on Colonizer's World Tour before. Lots of coups. Awash with coups and uprisings and drought and refugee problems. All of that plagued the Derg regime until 1991, where it was toppled by a coalition of rebel forces, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. The constitution was adopted in 1994, and Ethiopia's first multi-party elections were in 1995. So the aforementioned TPLF, Tigray People's Liberation Front, headed the coalition government for 30 years, even though they were only 5% of the population. There's never going to be any problems with that, right? Similarly to our time in Brazil, there were accusations of corruption. And in 2018, there were protests and a change in leadership with Abiy Ahmed taking over. And in November 2019, Ethiopia's 30-year ruling coalition, the EPRDF, merged into a single unity party called the Prosperity Party, much shorter, PP. This is the one that the TPLF was like, no, this is not for us. And interestingly enough, there's a couple of videos in the downstairs about Abiy Ahmed, because he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019 before this whole Tigray thing, for signing a deal and agreeing to a truce with Eritrea.
Okay.
So there had been this conflict with Eritrea since 1994, since like Ethiopia became a country. And they finally agreed to a truce between Eritrea, and then he was given the Nobel Peace Prize, and then he invaded Tigray, and guess who's helping? Because Tigray is in the northern part of Ethiopia, right against Eritrea. So the Eritrean troops are also part of the occupation and humanitarian crisis in Tigray. But it's really interesting that he went so quickly from this like liberal, progressive, peacemaking reformist to now a lot of people see him in a different light. So it's a fascinating history in Ethiopia. I don't think I covered it all, but I think I talked for long enough that you have understood some things about Ethiopia. And it's time for our Jeopardy Fun Facts as a wrap up. Dr. K, what's yours?
That Selassie is the chief god of Rastafarianism.
What? Yeah.
Like, I think I heard that somewhere along the way and didn't really connect dots. And then I sat there and I was like, okay, he is the literal god.
Of Rastafarianism.
Of Rastafarianism.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that's a deep dive I haven't gone down yet, but I'm going to have to now because we've spent this time in Ethiopia where I'm like,
okay. Sure. I can also 100% hear that being asked on Jeopardy. So.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. So mine is one of my favorite Jeopardy fun facts we've had this entire Colonizer's World Tour, and that is Ethiopia has their own calendar. They are not in the Gregorian calendar. Their calendar is about 7 years and 3 months behind the Gregorian calendar. So it is not 2022 in Ethiopia. It is in fact 2015. And my predominant thought when I learned that was Ethiopia hasn't experienced 2020 yet. Is their 2020 going to be as horrible as ours? Or I mean, their 2020 was 2013, technically. And I will be referencing this fact again in the next video on this playlist, or tomorrow when we talk about our film from Ethiopia, because it was one of the travel companies that was involved in this documentary references the 7-year calendar gap. So that was, yeah, humans, man.
Wild.
I mean, like,
and every sign.
Yeah.
That you, like, go, it's got the Western date and the Ethiopian date of, like, when something was founded.
That's amazing. Yeah, because I mean, like, you know, obviously not everyone is on the Gregorian calendar, but, like, the Arabic calendar is, like, hundreds of years off of ours. So, like, that's not even, like, close. But this one was just, like, 7 years and 3 months. So, gonna need to do some more digging. Does it have anything to do with Ethiopian Orthodoxy? I don't know. But maybe someday we'll find out. But I think now that the facts are out of the way, and the fascinating stories of religion and economy and Italy being terrible at colonizing, we'll put a pause in Italy and their terrible colonizing ways for now, and we'll jump back in with them next week in Libya. But we will see you tomorrow first for our Ethiopian film, Framing the Other. If you enjoyed this content on the YouTubes, please do the YouTubes things, like and subscribe, comment below. If you've been to Ethiopia or you have something you'd like to share with us about Ethiopia, please do so in the comments. We would love to hear from you. We love this journey so very much, and we want all the people to join us as well. If you would like to hear more from us, please click the link in the downstairs for our research digest, where we once a week tell you things similar to Jeopardy Fun Facts, but mostly focused on our work as empathy educators. And boy, do we have some heavy lifting to do for tomorrow's film, Framing the Other. If we don't see you before then in some other capacity, we hope we will see you then.
Bye, everybody.